Welcome to our virtual tour, Proclaiming a Republic. This exhibition at the National Museum of Ireland in Collins Barracks in Dublin tells the story of those who fought in the 1916 Easter Rising. It tells their stories through the objects, artefacts and personal effects that we have had on display here between 2016 and 2020.
So in the exhibition, we actually look at the history from a lot of different angles. So we're looking at it from the women's perspective, from civilians' perspective, from the perspective of what happened to children. You can pick on one object in the exhibition and really deep dive into the history of that object and what it really talks about.
I hope when people leave, having seen the exhibition, that they go away with a sense of the lesser-known figures from the Rising, and also a sense of what people sacrificed at the time during the Rising.
In this film, we focus on what happened during the 1916 rebellion. Some of the stories you'll see and hear might be about people you haven't heard of before. The objects that belong to them allow us to explore some of the key themes in the exhibition. In particular, we look at the choices people made, and we hope this virtual tour will give you a better understanding of the 1916 Easter Rising. At 11:50 a.m. on Easter Monday, 150 rebels arrived here in Sackville Street, now O'Connell Street, and rushed the GPO, taking over the building. At 12:45, Patrick Pearse came outside and, dressed in the green uniform of the Irish Volunteers, read the proclamation of the Irish Republic. Irish men and Irish women, in the name of God and of the dead generations from which he receives her old tradition of nationhood, Ireland, through us, summons her children to her flag and strikes for her freedom.
Overnight on Easter Sunday in 1916 in Liberty Hall, Dublin, the Proclamation of Independence was printed. This document, to be read on the first day of the rebellion, declared an Irish Republic, completely independent from Britain. Significantly, it was written for both Irish men and Irish women, and included a declaration of equal rights and civil liberties. The names of the proclamation's 7 signatories, Patrick Pearse, James Connolly, Tomás McDonagh, Thomas Clarke, Eamon Ceannt, Sean McDermott and Joseph Plunkett, are well known across Ireland. But what other people's stories can be told by this artefact? For most people who think of the 1916 Rising, they think of the proclamation. And this particular document belonged to Dr. Kathleen Lynn, and she was the Chief Medical Officer of the Irish Citizens' Army during the rebellion.
What I like to talk about first about the proclamation is actually the part that you can't see, right? And that's on the back, Kathleen Lynn and 10 other women who were imprisoned in Mountjoy after the Rising chose to sign this document and kind of mark themselves in history and associate themselves very clearly and directly with what is written in the proclamation. And I think that's really important. They knew that this was going to be maybe in a museum one day, or at least talked about one day, and they wanted to be associated with it.
It's also signed by the 2 compositors and the printer. The text had been given to Christopher Brady by Tomás McDonagh on the Saturday, and then over 24 hours, 2,500 of these documents were printed.
Yeah, and they had to get these out really quickly and secretly. And so what we find with the document are some of the ways that we can tell it's an original. The errors, the anomalies, the quick fixes that they had to make. When I give this tour in person, I love to kind of talk about the mistakes and see what we can point out. Certainly, you know, this wouldn't have been typed up or anything like that. It would have been individual letters laid out in a press. And so that's where we see these anomalies, is in not having enough lettering, in rushing the lettering and not having time to go back and scan it. And so we see the lettering behind you there that they would have laid out individually into the press to then make this document.
So these would have been highly trained compositors and printers. They would have served apprentices for 7 years, and it was highly unlikely that they would have made mistakes like this. And it really shows the pressure they were under to get this seditious document out.
When we look at the line that says Irish Republic, the C was an O, and so they would have put perhaps a bit of sealant wax over it so that the O would have become a C. Also, in the word the, you're going to see kind of a different tail on the end of that E, and so that likely was an F that they had to add a bit.
And you can see that the document was actually signed by the 7 signatories, and they knew that when their names would appear on this document, that they were signing their own death warrants. This was treason. It was a seditious document, and they knew that they would be making a blood sacrifice for the Irish Republic and for the people of Ireland.
Yeah. And we know these names and we learn about them a bit further in the exhibition, but you also have then some names that maybe aren't as common, and that represents the ordinary people who would have chosen to participate in this rebellion and how they chose to do so in their own ways, that this wasn't just 7 men who decided to start a rebellion, but that it was ordinary people fighting for what they wanted, this free and independent Ireland.
We went back to the background, trying to explain why an Ireland that was outwardly peaceful, probably the most peaceful it had been in centuries in the early 20th century, suddenly went to outright war.
What we really wanted to focus on what the motivations were for people to have participated in this event. So you have a lot of different groups coming from a lot of different ideologies and philosophies.
How did an Ireland which was outwardly at peace in 1900 come to rebellion in 1916? In 1913, 2 armies had formed in Ireland. The Ulster Volunteer Force was formed to stop Home Rule, which would give Ireland a level of independence from Britain. This had been promised by the British government to come into law by 1914. The Irish Volunteers were formed as a response to the Ulster Volunteers. But why had these 2 groups been necessary, and who was joining them?
When we look at this exhibition and the objects and the stories that we chose to tell in here, the role of children comes to light. And so what we learn from the children is that they would have likely gained their political leanings from their parents. Their parents may have been unionists, they may have wanted to stay a part of Britain, or they might have been nationalists and they might have wanted an independent Ireland. One of the groups that came out of that nationalist belief, founded by Bulmer Hobson and Countess Markievicz, would have been Na Fianna Éireann. We have here a replica hat from Na Fianna Éireann, and in this case we also have a tunic from a child who was a member, John Kelly. John Kelly would have been 10 years old when the rising began, and he actually would have participated himself. He would have been trained how to fight through Fianna Éireann. They actually went to Countess Markiewicz's house and had their target practice there. So in addition to what we might traditionally think of Boy Scouts being, camping skills, life skills, they also would have been learning the Irish language, they would have been learning Irish dances, and they would have been learning how to fight. We also find children whose families brought them up in a unionist setting, and so believing that Ireland should stay with Britain. And in that we have the example here of 9-year-old Alfie Knight, who would have written asking to be allowed to participate in World War I. And so there's different ways that children were coming and being raised during this time. One of the questions I like to ask when I have students here on the tour with me after we learn about John Kelly, and I'll put it to you now as well, what in your life at your age would make you willing to learn how to fight in such a way, to participate in a rebellion in such a way? What factors would you consider?
So in the week leading up to the 1916 Rising, we're seeing obviously the plans become more concrete and more people being told about the rebellion. And one person who's only now beginning to be told about it is actually this man here, Owen McNeill, who is the leader of the Irish Volunteers, who the rebels have to basically bring on side, so he'll let the volunteers fight. Now, 2 days before the Rising begins, he hears about the sinking of the Ode.
Well, he had been convinced on Thursday night to lend his support to the Rising because there were guns coming from Germany with Roger Casement. Casement was captured on Bannistrand in County Kerry on Good Friday, together with the Ode, which was scuttled in Cork Harbour by its captain after it had been intercepted by the Royal Navy. He decided then to stop all manoeuvres and stop the Rising.
And of course, it's that which must lead to him putting his famous countermandor letter in the Irish newspapers, which says volunteers completely deceived, all orders for tomorrow Sunday are entirely cancelled, which actually have the original copy of here in this case.
And that was carried to volunteer companies all around the country. Those that were trying to organise the Rising then had a decision to make whether they try and go ahead on Sunday or they postponed it by 24 hours. They postponed it by 24 hours and came out on Easter Monday. The next part of the exhibition deals with the rebel garrisons and where they were located in Easter week in 1916. On Easter Monday, the rebels occupied a number of key buildings around the city. In addition to the headquarters garrison in the General Post Office, there were 6 other garrisons in the city. We are going to have a look at some of the objects associated with those garrisons now. The rebels in Dublin were divided across the city. There were 4 battalions of the Irish Volunteers based in the areas around the Four Courts, Jacob's Biscuit Factory, Boland's Mill and the South Dublin Union. The Irish Citizen Army sent men and women to St Stephen's Green and to Dublin Castle. 5 of the 7 signatories, as well as initially 150 rebels, took over the GPO on Sackville Street.
The first garrison we look at is behind me here at Stephen's Green. At 11:40 a.m. on Easter Monday, approximately 40 rebels took over the green. They cleared it of civilians, built barricades, and dug defensive trenches. Now at about 4 a.m. on the second day of fighting, the British troops took over the Shelburne Hotel here behind me. Machine gunners took to the roof and opened fire, forcing the rebels to evacuate from the green to the Royal College of Surgeons. As the rebels came under heavy fire, they dashed from Stephen's Green to the Royal College of Surgeons behind me here. You can still today see the bullet holes from the machine gunners. The rebels entered through the side door, barricaded themselves inside, eventually surrendering at the end of the week.
At this part of the exhibition, we talk about the role of Countess Markievicz during the actual week of 1916. And she finds her way to St Stephen's Green with Michael Mallon, and she is under his command. She's second in command, in fact, as part of the Irish Citizen Army.
Countess Markievicz would have been using this wristwatch to time messages going to the GPO and other places to kind of keep up. And that lets us know a bit more about the role that women could have played in it.
This bandolier is actually Countess Markiewicz's, and also the Sam Brown belt as well, which she would have worn as part of her uniform. You can actually see an Irish citizen's uniform or a tunic behind there. Very few people could afford a full uniform. They had to pay for them by instalments, but because Countess Markievicz was wealthy enough, she could actually completely tog out in her full uniform. We have a bandolier here, which is part of the handling objects here in the museum. You can feel the weight of it, and it's made of leather, and it would have held her ammunition for her firearm, and she would have worn it across her body like that. And you can see in the picture behind, the men are actually wearing that bandolier, and it's the most common thing that they can afford to have, but they're trying to unify themselves. Very important to have a uniform in the time of a rising, because you have to know which side you're fighting on.
Countess Markievicz She would have been, as you said, second in command to Malin, sending these messages out. But we also know about her that she would have allowed for her home to be used for na Fianna Éireann. We know that she would later go on to be one of the 77 women arrested. She was the one who, because of her role in organizing it, was sentenced to execution. That was later stayed to life in prison. We know she didn't serve the rest of her life in prison. In fact, we know she went on to be the first woman elected to the British Parliament. And per Sinn Féin policy at the time, she did not take that seat in protest.
And of course, there were other women involved in 1916 in the roles of gun smugglers and arms smugglers. But you had Elizabeth O'Farrell, of course, who was a nurse stationed at the GPO. You had Julia Grennan.
Yeah, and when we're looking at the various roles that people played, it wasn't just men, it wasn't just women, there were also children. And so we look at somebody like Charles Darcy and the role that he played as a child in 1916.
The bearer Charles Darcy has attended at the above schools. I have much pleasure in bearing testimony to his good character and shall always be pleased to hear of his success in life.
As we continue learning about the children who participated in 1916 in the Rising, we come here to Charles Darcy, who would have been aged 15 when the rebellion started. He was part of the group that was charged with taking Dublin Castle, and in fact he was killed that first night, that first day, on top of the Henry and James Clothier's shop, and lost his life for this cause. And it's through these artifacts that we're able to remember him. We learn from his objects about his life and the family who remembered him. We see the 1916 medal, we see a letter of recommendation from a headmaster saying that he was punctual, attentive, comes highly recommended, and was really a star pupil, and one who left an impression. And I think that kind of speaks to the quality of character of this boy.
But why would a boy that age need a recommendation letter?
Great question. So when we think of a 15-year-old, we think of somebody who's still in school. But at the age of 15, Charles Darcy would have been working in the Pym's department store, and this would have been pretty common. He would have finished up school around the age of 12, 13, and would have gone into work and would have been doing things that adults that we think of nowadays would be doing, and kind of earning money for himself and for his family.
Young children that age in general, I mean, it is a sense that they're one of these voices in the 1916 Rising, which maybe up until recently we didn't hear that much about. Yeah. You know, and like in this exhibition, we're looking at ordinary stories for people during the rebellion. And another boy actually who would be the same age as Charles Darcy was a boy called Sean Healy. He gets hit by a bullet and he doesn't survive the rebellion. And very famously, his last words were, "God bless the volunteers." And we're actually very lucky we have his hat here in the museum. There's a poignancy as well to artifacts like these, because given us by Charles Darcy's family, so this would have been their way of remembering him.
We've talked about the children who chose to fight in the rebellion, but that's not the only way children became involved. Against the backdrop of the fighting here on Sackville Street, poverty-stricken children in the neighborhood saw an unmissable opportunity to loot the shops.
So this is an example of a toffee hammer. We have one here in the case, and that was actually found in one of the sweet shops on Sackville Street. And it's evidence of some kid throwing it against the plate glass to break the plate glass in order to get at those lovely chocolate eggs and sweets that were on display in the shop window on Sackville Street. And we have to remember that life was going on in the shadow of the GPO, and there were so many people living in the inner city at that time, but they were very, very poor. These areas were the tenements of Dublin. We had a high child mortality rate, the highest in Europe at one stage. And of course, when they saw these beautiful shops full of Easter eggs, you have to think that it was Easter, of course, and the display ladies would have been holding slabs of toffee, and you would have needed your toffee axe to crack the toffee so that you get little bits of toffee. So they would have been delighted. They would always remember, as James Stephens, the writer, wrote about it, and he said they would remember 1916 with a sweet taste in their mouth. They wouldn't remember it as being this traumatic affair. It was all about being able to get the sweets out of the sweet shops on Sackville Street. And there are a few items in this actually that were souvenirs of the rebellion. Like the ordinary Dubliner was coming in to see what was happening to their city. You know, Sackville Street was completely devastated. And people would have collected, for instance, I love these. These are the sugar bowls. And I always ask people when they come on the tour, what do they think these actually are? And they can never say. So they were sugar bowls, and the heat of the fire fused all these sugar bowls together to create this sort of almost work of art here.
So another item that we see in this case here, we have, of course, everybody recognizes a cricket bat, but if you look closely, you see that there's a bullet hole in there, and this would have been in Elvery's, the sports shop, and would have gotten shot at. It just kind of speaks to the dangers of being out and about. We now have it in the collection here, and it was a former curator, Michael Kenny, who coined the phrase, the cricket bat that died for Ireland.
And you can imagine the crossfire that was happening between the rebels and the British forces at the time. Like anything could have been caught up in that crossfire.
Yeah. Behind me here is where Jacob's Biscuit Factory used to stand. And when we look at the garrison that was stationed here during the rebellion, we find a different experience than what you'd expect. The men, women, and children who were stationed here did not see as much action as other garrisons, so instead of fighting, they had to find other ways to pass their time. When we go into this case here, we see a chessboard, something that most of us would have in our homes. But what it tells us is how they passed the time. So we know that there were children, specifically the Girl Scouts and the Fianna Éireann Boy Scouts, who would have been organizing games. They would have been reading in the library. There would have been a ceilidh organized specifically by the Girl Scouts. The role of the children in this space to kind of provide entertainment for one another and for the adults is really important and really valid, and just shows a bit broader the different ways that you could participate in this rebellion. So in looking in this case here, we have an example of an Irish Volunteers uniform that some of the members would have been able to afford. We have a story coming out of Jacob's Biscuit Factory through the leadership of Thomas McDonagh. When the surrender notice went around, people didn't believe it, didn't want to believe it, and McDonagh kind of put a choice to them. He said, you can surrender with me, or you can, kind of fold up this uniform, find civilian clothes, and escape and try to carry on the fight for Ireland another day. When I give this tour in person, what I like to ask and put to the group is, what would you have done? What would you have chosen? I don't think there's a right or wrong answer, but I think it's interesting to kind of weigh those two options and why we would choose which one that we did. So also in this case here, we find this little card commemorating 1916, and actually included on the card, we have 3 little scraps of the tricolour that would have flown over Jacob's Biscuit Factory, and these would have been clipped kind of as souvenirs. When we look at this exhibit and all of the flags that we have, this is also a flag. It just shows kind of the different ways that these were preserved or kept based on what was happening and who was choosing to preserve them.
After McNeill's countermanding order, there was considerable confusion. In Limerick, in Cork City, and in Dungannon, there were mobilisations of men who ended up being sent home again. There was a mobilisation in Enniscorthy, but they didn't see any fighting. In fact, it was Tuesday, after all the other garrisons had surrendered, that they actually surrendered in Enniscorthy. In Galway, 700 men mobilised, attacked RIC stations at Clarenbridge and Oranmore, and then surrendered. One of the more exciting and dramatic episodes after the Rising involves the escape of Liam Mellows, one of the leaders in Galway. who escaped after being on the run for about 5 months, dressed as a nun, wearing this veil here.
The thing I remember most clearly about its hoisting is that I had some kind of hazy idea that the flag should be rolled up in some kind of ball so that when it would be hauled up, it would break out. As a matter of fact, I did it that way because it did open out in the proper manner when hoisted. The flag was floating on Princess Street corner of the GPO.
So during Easter week, one of the most common things you would have seen all around the centre of Dublin were all these new flags being flown in all different garrison locations by the rebels. This one here is possibly one of the most famous, the Irish Republic flag, which was hoisted over the GPO by Eamon Bulfin on the first day of the Rising in 1916. I think lots of the rebels would speak about, say, this flag and the tricolour flying up the GPO, and that being a real symbolic moment for the rebellion. I mean, there's many first-hand accounts we see of people who say that it's actually when they see flags like the Irish Republic flag here or the tricolour flying over the GPO is when they feel like they're actually fighting for something.
And as well as signifying patriotism, it also identifies garrisons and places, and they chose to fly these flags here that you see throughout the exhibition. And a note would have went out to the leaders of those garrisons with instructions on how to make these flags. And these flags would have been handmade, and you can actually see that because there are inconsistencies in how the flags are designed and shown. But there are definite colours involved, so you have a green ground, and you also have the iconic harp, which really identifies Irish people and how they identify as being Irish as well. And we also have the plough and the stars, which was the flag of the Irish Citizens' Army, and that was in fact made by the Doneamer Guild.
And you can see by the state that the flags are in how much damage is being done to the GPO itself. And it's actually very well captured in this particular painting here called The Birth of the Republic by Walter Paget. And it shows you the sort of the chaos inside the building. You can see in the corner here, you can see the fires at the windows. You can see the roof collapsing here in the centre. It's worth saying with this particular flag here, the Republic flag, is that you can see while it comes from 1916, it's seen a huge amount of damage in its time as well. And part of it comes from, if you look, you can see those bullet holes all along top of the flag, all along here. And you can see this corner here where it would have been torn off as bits of souvenirs, because when the rebellion comes to an end, this flag is captured by the British troops. And there's a very famous photograph on the top of Parnell Street with the troops standing with this flag. The flag itself is upside down, which is a sign of sort of disrespect for it. Whereas unfortunately the other flag, the Irish tricolour, actually falls into the building during Easter week. And it's only a couple of very small fragments actually remain of it. And you can see in the destruction of that moment why the rebels realised they had to leave the GPO and why they had to evacuate, and how the Rising slowly began to come to an end.
So by Friday, the GPO was in flames and collapsing in on itself. The rebels decided to evacuate to this house, number 16 Moore Street. Patrick Pearse looked out one of the windows and saw civilians machine gunned down, even though they were carrying a white flag. Without hope of success or escape, the rebels decided to call for a ceasefire and surrender. Elizabeth O'Farrell emerged from here with a white handkerchief and walked towards Great Britain Street, at this end of the street, towards the British troops carrying this handkerchief white flag, and asked for a ceasefire.
So here we're looking at some of the final surrender notes from the end of the 1916 Rising. You can see this one here is a handwritten note by Pearse, which he would have written at the end of the rebellion. And also this one here, this is a typed version. You can see Pearse has signed it as well. But you also see it signed by James Connolly and Thomas McDonagh. So 3 of the 7 signatories would have signed this document right here. And this one was given to a woman called Elizabeth O'Farrell.
It's only recently that Elizabeth has become recognised as a huge part of that surrender moment in 1916. She was photographed beside Pearse at the time of surrender. And she was an amazing woman. She was actually a nurse and she was stationed at the GPO during the Rising. And she was chosen to deliver these surrender notes throughout Dublin between all the different garrisons. She was one of 3 women left in the GPO. And one was Winifred Carney, who was the secretary to James Connolly, and she was devastated that James had been injured in the way that he was. And you had Julia Grennan as well, and they remained behind to care for the sick and the wounded at the GPO. So Elizabeth O'Farrell then was chosen to deliver these surrender notes. She would have been fired on both by the British and by the rebels. She would carry a white flag from garrison to garrison. She was very lucky she wasn't shot and killed during that movement.
Absolutely, and it's worth saying as well that when she brings the note to the different garrisons, because you've got groups like the Irish Volunteers, Irish Citizens Army, they're being led by different people. So very famously, the Irish Citizens Army say that we won't surrender unless we get a note signed by James Connolly. So one thing she used to do, she used to take this note here and to bring it to Dublin Castle Hospital where James Connolly is after he gets injured in the GPO, and to get him to sign this note right here, telling the Citizens Army members that they have to surrender as well. For the people living in Dublin at this time, I mean, when the rebels are leaving their locations, they're being met with this incredible anger by many people, because the city has been destroyed. Unfortunately, in the Rising, the highest casualties are civilians who, aren't planning to go out and die for Ireland.
Yeah, the Dubliners were very opposed to the Rising. They didn't understand it, particularly the women who had their menfolk away at the front. It was, of course, in the middle of World War I, and they were expecting payments which were distributed through the GPO, and they didn't get their payments that week, and they were very upset, of course.
They see as essentially as an act of treason, and it's that idea of treason which is it plays such a key role in the British response at the end of this rebellion. After the Rising, we see 16 men executed, 14 here in Dublin, including the 7 signatories, between the 3rd and 12th of May 1916 in Kilmainham Jail. Their bodies are brought here to Arbour Hill and their possessions are returned to their families. The memorial in Arbour Hill now stands as a final resting place for the men. Thomas Kent is also executed in Cork, and a few months later Roger Casement was executed over in London. This space in the exhibition, this is where we focus on the executions. And obviously it's quite a sad location, so we don't necessarily bring tour groups in. Instead, we would let them sort of come in on their own and actually explore the area. So in the cases all along here, you see the final artifacts for the executed men. So these are the pieces they would have had with them, which were then given back to their families after the executions.
The leaders were tried under field court-martial because Britain was still at war with Germany, and as such they were traitors. And when they were executed, their bodies were not returned to their families, so there was no funerals. And that left a gap in the grieving process. And what became very, very important then were objects that they had in their last hours and their last days. One of the objects here, which is a very, very ordinary object, which stands out for me, is Eamon Cant's shoes. We all have shoes, they're very, very personal to us. He had them in a case with him when he fought in the South Dublin Union. He also had his uilleann pipes with him.
We have this shirt here, which is worn by James Connolly during the rebellion. And if you look on the arm, you can see a blood stain on it, because during Easter week, he leaves the building, the GPO, a couple of times. And one time he gets a bullet to the arm, one time he gets a bullet to the leg. So you can see the blood stain here from the injury he gets to his arm. But the leg, his shooting of his leg also is very important, because basically he can't actually stand for the execution itself. So he ends up being tied to a chair, and that evokes incredible anger among many people in Ireland.
Initially, public support was against the rebels, but because of the nature of how the executions took place, starting on the 3rd of May and continuing with 2, 3, 4 rebels over a number of days, almost one by one until the 12th of May, it was deemed as a very, very harsh treatment of the rebels.
As well as the executions, we also see about 3,500 people being arrested, of the majority of whom wouldn't have been involved in the 1916 Rising. And mainly being sent off to prison camps like, say, Frongach over in Wales. It's that severe British response, both the executions and the arrests, that begins to swing public opinion to supporting this idea of an independent Ireland.
In our short time on this virtual tour of this exhibition, we have learnt about the experiences of those caught up in the rebellion, be they rebels, British soldiers or civilians. We have also explored the theme of choice, including the perspectives of those who chose to fight and those who chose not to, and the decision of the British to proceed with executions after the rebellion. We have seen how important artefacts can be in revealing the past, and how even the most everyday objects have the power to tell unique stories, enhancing our understanding of history. Thank you very much for joining us on the virtual tour of the exhibition Proclaiming a Republic here at Collins Barracks in Dublin. Why not come and explore and visit some of our other museum sites in Dublin and Mayo? We hope to see you soon.